who thinks running Vacation Bible School is easy has never done it before. I'll be honest with you, it's hard work. It isn't for the faint of heart. You might have to stay up late and prep crafts. Or cook a million hot dogs. That smells good. Or go all out and transform the church into an African safari. It's a jungle out there. You might work yourself silly helping trainers and teachers. Not that way, this way. You might work yourself cuckoo with the VBS songs. They get stuck in your brain. You're good Father. And when the big week is finally finished, you even might collapse into a VBS-induced coma. But you do it anyway. You go the extra mile to learn every kid's name, play every game, sing every song, teach every Bible story. Not because it's fun, it isn't always fun. Not because it's easy, it isn't always easy. Not because you have to. It's easier not to do VBS at all. You do VBS because it's worth it. Sign up to be a VBS leader today and make this VBS a success. Yeah. I did pretty good that time.
Make sure you listen to the VBS boss and sign up to help with VBS. You don't want her coming to your house to call you out. VBS comes up later this summer. It's a huge event in the life of the church. My first exposure to Shady Grove was during VBS a couple years ago, and I showed up, and there was 300 and some kids running around acting crazy. So we need you to sign up and help make VBS happen again. My name's Tom. I'm one of the two pastors here along with Pastor Lee. She's taken a group of young people to another church this morning so they could experience how another church worships as part of the confirmation journey that they're all on. But we are here together, and I'm glad you're here. If you're a guest with us today, thank you for being here. You could have been anywhere this morning, but you're here with us, and we're glad you are. And I want to know you're here. And the way you let me know is one of those blue connection cards in the seat in front of you. Just fill out as much as you want to fill out, and if you have questions about the church, you can check the block, and we'll do our best to get back to you in a timely manner. After the service, take it across the lobby to the connections desk and hand them your little blue card, and we have a gift for you for being in worship with us today, just to let you know how grateful we are that you chose to be here. And in just a few minutes, we'll take up our offering, and if you're a guest, I don't want you to feel obligated to put any money in the offering whatsoever. Your presence here is gift enough. A couple things I want you to remember as you leave today. We also have a prayer card. If there's anything you'd like us to join with you in asking God for, or join with you in thanking God for, you can use that yellow prayer card. Just drop it in the offering box here in a few minutes when we take up our offering this morning. Just a couple things coming up. There's some VBS work nights to get this place ready. We're going to turn the whole church into an African safari, so we need lots of bodies to help make that happen. So that's coming up soon. It'll be on Wednesday and Thursday nights, and I believe there's more information in your bulletin about that. The Rising is our worship celebration that kicks off Holy Week. Will be next Sunday afternoon. The men of the church are cooking hamburgers and hot dogs, and bring a finger food or a dessert to go with it. We'll have music. We'll have egg hunts for the kids. And what's the best thing about egg hunts? Is it the eggs? No. As soon as you get home, the eggs get thrown away, right? The best thing is the candy inside the egg. So if you can help us with a little bit of candy when you go by the grocery store this week, or you go by Kelly's after worship to get a hot dog, pick up some candy, pick up a bag or two, and drop it by the church this week. So we'll make sure we have tons of candy for the Rising coming up soon. We're going to take up our offering here in just a few moments. The regular offering goes in the box that sits on the floor. It's on both sides of the platform here. In the Grove, it's on the left side of the platform. If you're home watching online, go to the website. There's a Give Online button you can click, and you can participate in the offering along with us. The box on the floor is where our general budget offering goes. The basket on top is our weekly mission box. It's just a way that we can release a little more compassion into the world. We ask for $1 from every person present. You're certainly welcome to give more if you'd like. And this week it goes to Campus Crusade on local college campuses. And a college campus has got to be one of the hardest places right now to live out your faith. So everything we can do to help ministries on college campuses, we should be involved in. So this is one way we can help to give to today's mission box, and it goes to Campus Crusade. Let's pray together. God, we are so thankful that you have given us this beautiful place to worship, that as we gather, we can see friends old and friends new when we come together on Sunday mornings in this beautiful place. Thank you for the gift of fellowship and the opportunity we have to build community every time we come together. Or we're here to pursue you, God, to tell you how good a God you are and how much you mean to us. And God, just to let you know how we love you and that we want everything we do to bless you. We pray that our music and participating in that, God, as we sing songs to you, would bless you. That the way we treat each other, not just today but every day, would bless you. That the prayers that we share together and individually would bless you. We want our lives to be a blessing to you as you've blessed us first. God, we give this time to you. We give ourselves to you because you have blessed us and you have given everything to us. In your name we pray. Amen.
I'll search for the light of day in the dead of night. We've all found ourselves worn out from the same old fight. We've all run to things that we know just ain't right. There's a better life. There's a better life. If you got pain, he's a pain taker. If you feel lost, he's a way maker. You need freedom, saving. He's a prison shaking savior. You got chains, he's a chain breaker. You believe it, you receive it. If you can't feel it, somebody testify. If you believe it, if you receive it, if you can't feel it, somebody testify. If you believe it, if you receive it, you can feel it. Somebody testify. You got pain. He's a pain taker. You feel lost. He's a way maker. You need freedom, saving. He's a prison shaking savior. You got chains. He's a chain breaker. You need freedom, saving. He's a prison shaking savior. You got chains. He's a chain breaker. Worthy of every song we could ever sing. Worthy of all the praise we could ever bring. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you. We live for you. Holy, there is no one like you. There is no trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Father God, we put our trust in you. We put our love in you. For the love you have given, God, it is more. It is more. It is always more. Give us the eyes to see and the ears to hear, God. And the hearts to feel that love. The hearts to give that love with the perspective to view that love the way that you would have us see it. The way that you would have us share it. The way that you would have us give it back to the world. So as we sit here humble before you, God, open before you, God, to hear you, feel you, to love you, we ask your name in this kingdom that is yours, in this glory that is all of you. In your Son's name, Jesus, that we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Brandon. Thank you. Thank you. Today we continue our walk towards Easter Sunday morning in this series titled Perspective. And we're looking at Jesus and the life, the ministry of Jesus through the eyes of Mark, who tells us this story that Peter told him. Peter was the eyewitness. He shared the story with Mark. Mark wrote it down. And perspective is important when it comes to matters of faith, because what we see determined by where we stand. And if we stand looking at Jesus through the eyes of Mark, a couple things stand out. And one of those things that stands out is the way Mark constantly is reminding us of the humanity of Jesus and the divinity of Jesus. Fully human and fully God at the very same time. And I don't know about you, but that's a hard thing to grasp. I have a hard time wrapping my head around how God could come to earth fully human, just like me, just like you, but at the same time, fully God. And Mark never lets us lose perspective of either one of those. He begins by telling us the most important thing, that Jesus is the Son of God. Chapter 1, verse 1, he is the Messiah, the Son of God. And he never lets us forget that as he begins his report on the ministry of Jesus. He tells us that John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, baptizes him in the Jordan River. Jesus endures the temptations of Satan. He begins calling the disciples. He calls Simon, Andrew, James, and John, the first four that he calls. We talked about how Jesus spoke and acted with authority in the synagogue at Capernaum, that a man with unclean spirit stood up and interrupted everything while Jesus was teaching. And Jesus used his power that didn't exist on earth prior to his arrival, to call that spirit out of the man who was interrupting worship. He spoke and he acted with absolute authority. And as you read on through Mark, he begins to work a series of miracles. The first miracle recorded in Mark, he heals a leper, person with leprosy. He heals a paralyzed man. He heals a man who had a deformed hand. And then he goes on to call the rest of the 12 disciples. He's accused of being possessed by Satan. And then the first parable is shared with us, Jesus' first parable, and it's the one we talked about last week, the farmer scattering seed. Then it's followed up by the parable of the lamp, followed by the parable of growing seed, and then the parable of the mustard seed. And shortly after that, his disciples have spent a considerable amount of time with him. They've seen him work miracles. He's taught them what they should do. And then he sends them out 2 by 2 to go across the country, go across Palestine, and heal people and cast out demons in his name. So 2 by 2, the disciples go out on what Mark calls their tour. And after some time passes, they're 2 of them together in groups, so 6 teams go out and do ministry across Palestine, and they come back, and they're obviously exhausted. So Jesus grabs all 12 of them and said, let's escape for a little while. Let's go away and rest for a time. So he leads the 12 away, but there's a problem. They never get to rest. A huge crowd follows them out of town, and Mark tells us that there's 5,000 men. So if there's 5,000 men, most of the men were probably married. So we're somewhere around 8,000 men and women. You throw kids in there, it might be 10,000 people. And they're going off to rest, being followed by 10,000 people. Jesus sees this huge crowd. And one of the things Mark does very well, as I said in the very beginning, he continually reminds us of the humanity of Jesus. Fully God and also fully human. So he tells us that Jesus sees this huge crowd and he has compassion for them. So even though he was trying to get the disciples out of town so they could rest after their ministry tour, he starts teaching. And he taught not an hour, not 2 hours. He taught all day long. And dinner time arrived, and the disciples wanted Jesus to send all the people back to town. Because they had left so quickly, they hadn't packed anything for lunch. And they ran right by lunch listening to Jesus teach, and now it was dinner time. And the disciples said, Jesus, send them back to town. And Jesus said, you feed them. And don't you think the 12 disciples looked at each other and thought, what? How in the world are we going to feed 8, 9, 10,000 people? But Jesus said, you feed them. So they did a very smart thing. They began to argue with Jesus. And I don't know if you've ever had an argument with Jesus or an argument with God, God the Father or God the Son, either one. Rarely does that go your way. And it did not go the 12 disciples' way. He said, feed them. So they go off to walk among all the people and try to figure out what resources they had to feed these people with. And as I said, they had all sort of run out of town quickly to follow Jesus, and they hadn't packed any lunch, they hadn't packed any dinner, they couldn't order pizza, they had nothing. But they found one little boy who had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Now, when I say loaf of bread, what do you think? You think of like Merita with 30-some slices in it, right? And you could feed some people with 5 loaves of bread. That's 150 slices. That's 75 sandwiches, but that's a long way from 10,000 people. And that's not what it was. It wasn't a big loaf of bread. It's more, if this had happened in the South, the little kid would have had 2 fish and 5 biscuits. You with me? They were like, small. So that's all the food they can find among these 10,000 people. So Jesus said, give it to me, and Jesus held it, and he blessed it, and then he put it in their hands, and they started dividing up the bread and the fish. And the more they divided it up, the more they had. And before all was said and done, they had fed every single person there with 5 biscuits and 2 little fish, and they picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. An amazing miracle, right? But don't miss this part. Where did the miracle happen? Did the miracle happen while Jesus had it in his hands? Did it? It happened when he put it in the disciples' hands, and the disciples did what he told them to do. The miracle happened when the disciples were giving out the bread and the fish. Now, Jesus blessed it and caused the miracle to happen, but the disciples got to experience that miracle in their own hands. The more bread they broke off and the more fish they tore apart and handed out, the more bread and the more fish they had in their hands. Could you imagine being the one with that in your hands? And if there's 12 disciples and 10,000 people, or let's just say there's 12,000 people, you feed 1,000 people with a little bit of bread and fish that would fit in your hand? And not only that, afterwards you help clean up and you gather 12 more baskets of leftovers. Wouldn't that blow you away? And keep in mind, that happened after their ministry tour, when they went out 2 by 2, and they healed people in Jesus' name. And they cast out demons in Jesus' name. Jesus wasn't present with them, yet they still saw miracles happen. What kind of impact would that have on you if you had been personally chosen by Jesus? He said, look, will you follow me? If he said that to you, and you spent time following him, and you saw him work miracles, and then he sends you out with one other of the disciples, and you see miracles happen. And then you're 10, 12,000 people, 8,000, I don't know how many, but 5 little pieces of bread and 2 fish. That would just blow us away, wouldn't it? But right after, something interesting happens. And I've read through this story, I don't know how many times, and I never picked up on this until I was getting ready for this series. Right after they fed all these people and they cleaned up. You have to clean up. Jesus wants you to clean up afterwards. They packed up all these 12 baskets of leftovers. Jesus sends the disciples away. And I never thought about that before, but why in the world would Jesus send the disciples away when he had a captive audience, and he could have sent them out to work the crowd and cast more demons out and heal more people and do more ministry right there with this group of people. But instead, he sends them away. In Mark chapter 6, verse 45, it said, immediately after this, after they fed everybody, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida while he sent the people home. That didn't make sense. He missed this incredible opportunity for his hand-picked, hand-trained, and productive disciples to do ministry with 10, 8, 9, 10,000 people. Why in the world did he send people away? Mark doesn't tell us. He just tells us that Jesus sent the disciples away right after all the people were fed and the leftovers were picked up. Remember, I shared with you that the Gospels, the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, tell many of the same stories, but different ones focus on different details. Mark tells us that Jesus sent the disciples away, but he doesn't tell us why. John tells us why. John chapter 6. When the people saw him do this miraculous sign, the feeding of the people, they exclaimed, surely he is the prophet we have been expecting. When Jesus saw they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away into the hills by himself. Mark doesn't tell us that, but John does. So John said right after the feeding, they wanted to make him king right there. So Jesus snuck away. Being made king on their terms was the last thing Jesus wanted. The last thing. But wouldn't we think that for them to decide, well, Jesus is here and he's amazing, let's make him king. You'd think that'd be a good thing, right? But it wasn't a good thing. They wanted to see Jesus as king, but on their terms. And Jesus was and is king, but he was only going to become king in their eyes his way. They wanted to support him and make him king that day because he had given them something they wanted. They were hungry, he fed them. That is bought loyalty. That's not genuine loyalty. It's bought loyalty. And maybe we're not very different. Maybe we want Jesus when we need strength in hard times, and we support Jesus when we find peace in some turmoil or some chaos. But when Jesus has demands on us for something, when Jesus challenges us to do something, bought loyalty comes to an end. So Jesus wasn't about to be made king on their terms for some political reason or just in return for the fact that he met their needs. They loved him for what they could get from him. And maybe we do that. They wanted to use Jesus for their purposes, for their dreams. They wanted Jesus on their terms. They wanted a king according to their mold. Now, when we say, Jesus, give me strength to accept your plans, is there ever a time when what we really mean is, Jesus, give me strength and bless my plans? I think there is. Your outline, if you want to follow along. We must accept both the blessings of Jesus and the challenges Jesus brings. And John tells us why he sent the disciples away. He did not want the disciples to get caught up in this movement towards bought loyalty, this movement towards making Jesus a political king on the wrong terms. He would be king. In fact, he was already king. But he would be king on his terms. And the people had to discover how he would be king. And he didn't want the disciples to get caught up in that mess, so he sent them away. So they wouldn't get caught up in the conversations about, well, Jesus has given us this. He's amazing. Let's make him king. It's not how it had to happen. So to make sure it didn't happen that way and they didn't get caught up in them, he just sent them away. Right after they picked up 12 baskets of leftovers, they went down, got in the boat, and were heading across the lake because Jesus told them to leave. We'll pick up the story from Mark 6. Immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and head across the lake to Bethsaida while he sent the people home. After telling everyone goodbye, he went up in the hills by himself to pray. Late that night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake, and Jesus was alone on land. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard and struggling against the wind and the waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. He intended to go past them, but when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. And they were all terrified when they saw him. But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Don't be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I'm here." Then he climbed into the boat, and the wind stopped. They were totally amazed, for they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. That last sentence is difficult to read. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. Because these are the 12 guys that Jesus had invited by name personally to follow him. And as they followed him, they saw him work miracles. He healed people who were crippled. He healed people who were blind. He healed people who had a terminal illness called leprosy. He reshaped a man's deformed hand. They saw him do it. And then he sent them out on their ministry tour, and they saw miracles come from their speaking the truth in Jesus' name. They saw it, they lived it, they experienced it. And then on that hillside earlier that same day, they saw Jesus turn this much food into enough for 10,000, 8,000, and more. Yet their hearts were too hard to take it in. How could their hearts still be too hard? But then I was reminded of my heart. Because haven't we seen a miracle or two around here? Haven't we? I mean, look to your left, look to your right. There sit two miracles. Yet sometimes my heart is still too hard to accept Jesus as king on his terms. And I think if we're honest, we could all probably say that that's true for us at some time or another. That even though we've had 2,000 years of that story being told, and we have access to those stories, and we have even seen miracles in our time, sometimes my heart's too hard to take it in. And I ask you to consider, is yours ever that way? After Jesus sent the disciples away, then he told all the people to leave too. He went up in the hills beside the Sea of Galilee to pray. And he went up to pray because he had a lot going on. Think about where he was in his ministry and who all was against him. The religious leaders, the orthodox religious leaders of his own faith, the Jewish leaders, they were openly hostile. Remember I said in the beginning as I kind of rolled through the story of Jesus' life and the way that Mark lays it out, there were those who thought Jesus was possessed by Satan. Guess who they were? The church leaders. So he was dealing with that the people of his own faith considered him to be possessed by Satan. So he was carrying that load. Herod, the Roman ruler of Galilee and little surrounding area, he ruled a quarter of the Roman Empire. And he was so paranoid that when Jesus started to get popular, he wanted him dead. At the very least, he wanted him in prison. So not only was the religious leaders after him, the Roman ruler was after him. And who had more power? Who had more soldiers they could send after him than the Roman ruler? So he's carrying that load. And there were hotheads in the Jewish faith who wanted to make him into a political and a military king. And that's the last thing he wanted. And here he had disciples who he had poured his life into and allowed them to work miracles, whose hearts were still too hard to take it in. So what more does he have to do? So I can understand why he went off up in the hills by himself to pray. Makes sense to me. And he prayed. Apparently he stayed up all night praying. And as he stayed up all night praying, the disciples stayed up all night rowing. The Sea of Galilee was only 4 miles across at that point, but shortly after dark, the wind kicked up, and the wind was against them, so they were traveling into the wind to get to Bethsaida. And if you pull up a map of that part of the world, pull up a map of the Sea of Galilee, you'll see Capernaum where they were, and you'll see Bethsaida where they were going to, only 4 miles away. So they started off rowing, or they started off sailing, and the wind turned around against them, so they had to row. And from where he was up in the hills, Jesus could see all the way across the Sea of Galilee, and he could see the disciples in the boat. I don't know what kind of boat it was. It was big enough to hold 12 people. And he could see that they were struggling. So think about what happened. Think about what happened. It tells us so much about the character of Jesus. And one of the things Mark's perspective keeps reminding us over and over and over of the humanity, the emotion that Jesus had. So as he sat up on the hillside and he looked down onto the lake, he could tell the wind had turned around and that his friends in the boat were struggling in a storm. And he immediately left where he was and went to help. Now, what would you say is more significant? The Roman ruler wants you dead. Your own religious leaders want you dead. Your disciples still don't understand. And the people that you're trying to lead want to make you king on their terms. That's what he had on his shoulders. But he set all of that aside to go help his disciples who were going through a little wind. Who had the heavier load that night? Jesus did by far. But something about Jesus that Mark wants us to see. He wants us to have his perspective, to see that Jesus laid all of his burdens aside and went to help his friends. The challenges of Jesus require us to put others first, to put our needs aside, to put others first, and then the blessings of Jesus follow. There's such a huge lesson in that. N.T. Wright, I've mentioned to you before, is one of the foremost New Testament scholars in the world today. He's an English guy, has this beautiful accent. And he wrote a little piece from that night from the perspective of Thomas, the disciple, from inside the boat. I want to share that with you. So there we were on the boat. We didn't know why he was in such a hurry that we should leave, and we don't know where he'd gone now or what he was expecting would happen next. It just seemed that there was quite a sense of excitement after that extraordinary business with the loaves. And once people had got over their hunger, they started to ask questions. They wanted to know how it happened. And some were getting very enthusiastic. And then Jesus told us to leave at once. The last thing we saw was him heading up into the hills, probably off to pray again. He's always doing that, and I wish I knew what he said. Anyway, we were back to the usual routine on the boat, taking turns with the sails. Although that didn't last long because the wind swung around, unpredictable as ever with those hills around the lake. And so it was back to the oars again. All right for those who'd always done it for a living, but for the rest of us, it's horribly hard work. And you take the skin off your fingers if you don't grip the oar properly, which I never seem to be able to manage. And for most of the time, it looks like you're getting nowhere, watching the landmarks on the shore, and we didn't seem to be moving at all. Then we realized night was on the way, and darkness comes quickly in the spring. Soon all we could see was a few fires by the shore, probably shepherds, I suppose. And there we were, between the black sky and the black water, nobody saying much now, everybody tired, almost forgetting the ridiculous things we'd just seen, taking turns with the oars, losing track of time, but everybody longing for sleep. And what was that? Did you see something? Yes, over there, it can't be. It must be a ghost. We're being followed. Perhaps we're doomed. Perhaps it's an angel of death coming to drown us all. And then the voice. So calm, so natural. Almost as though it was teasing us. Here we are, dropping our oars in fright, and there was he, y'all, as though he was out for an afternoon stroll, going to walk right by us. And then, cheer up, it's me. Like, what's the problem? I wanted to say, what do you mean, cheer up? I've lived by this lake all my life, and this is the first time I'd ever seen anyone walking on it. What's going on? Perhaps we're all mad, or perhaps the whole world has gone mad, or perhaps now he's speaking again. And this time I sense that he's looking straight at me. Funny how he makes you feel like that. He said, don't be afraid. Well, why not, I thought. Anyone in my position? And then it happened. Like it sometimes does when he speaks to you. Like a cold drink on a hot day. Don't be afraid. He says that a lot. And it rings bells with things I've heard in the synagogue, in the scriptures. Angels say it to people. God says it sometimes too. Now he's saying it. It was all a little too much. I simply couldn't put it all together. The healings, the parties, those lawyers getting angry with him, then his cousin being killed, all this business with the loaves, and now this. Maybe we're all crazy. Maybe we're all going to die if we follow him, but I've never known anybody like him, and nor has anybody I know. And when we went off to see his cousin down by the Jordan, John seemed pretty clear that Jesus was the one. I'll tell you what, though. I'd rather row across the lake in a storm when he tells me to than do what that jumped-up King Herod down the road would like us to do. I always had a picture in my mind of what the ideal king would look like, and Jesus isn't at all like that. Herod certainly isn't and could never be. In fact, I have a sense that Jesus is trying to be a different sort of king, and it's very appealing, his sort of kingdom, even though I still don't see how it all works out. Perhaps it'll always be this way for anybody who wants to follow Jesus now or any time later. Perhaps what he wants from us is not that we should be able to explain it all, but that we should just be clear that we're always going to follow him. I may not be the sharpest tool in the box. My father used to say that because he was a carpenter too, like Jesus' father. But I reckon I'm in this for the long haul. I may not always understand it first time off, but I'll still show up. Mark never lets us lose sight of Jesus being heaven's king. So my question for you is just this. How is Jesus king to you? Have you fit him into your idea of what a king should be, like the crowds wanted to do after he fed them? Or have you accepted that Jesus is king only on his terms? And have you given him the freedom to be king in your life? Even when he asks you to do hard things. When we combine where we started this series with Jesus' authority, both speaking and acting with authority, and bringing power to bear that could not have come from inside this created world but comes from the outside, when we combine that with Jesus' demand that he be king only on his terms, how can we say no when he demands anything from us? Anything less than being all in would be making Jesus king on our terms and not allowing him to be king on his terms. If we're free to pick and choose from the demands he makes, but we can't even say that because we're not free to pick and choose. If Jesus is truly king in your life, you are not free to pick and choose. Either he's king or he's not. Anything less than full surrender means we're treating Jesus as king on our terms. And he is less than the king he's always been, the king he is today, and the king he will always be. How is Jesus king to you? Near the end of his ministry, he gathered the 11 remaining from those 12 he called in the beginning. They came together to celebrate Passover because they were Jewish. They celebrated Passover every year. The annual celebration of God's work to free their ancestors from enslavement in Egypt. When the angel of death passed over the Jewish homes, and that led to their freedom. So they celebrate that every year, and part of that celebration is a piece of bread. A loaf of bread that we look at today as a reminder that we're one. We're all together in this. That we are one loaf. We're connected. But he took that piece of bread and said, "This is my body. And soon my body will be broken. But today, take a piece of who I am into you." There's a very physical, tangible part of this that's the bread. We can all make bread. Water, flour, whatever else goes in bread. Bisquick, I'm not sure. It's a very tangible part of this, but there's a supernatural part of this as well. Because for us, this is Jesus' body. And the disciples struggled to understand. Some of them probably still had some hardness in their hearts even then. We still struggle to understand sometimes too, don't we? And then he took a cup full of wine, and he blessed it. He said, "When my body's broken, my blood will be spilled. This blood, my blood that I willingly allow to be spilled, is how we relate now. My life, in me, I've fulfilled that old covenant that God the Father made with Abraham. And this is the new way that we relate, through my sacrifice." And for this to be anything other than bread and juice, he had to be king on his terms. For this to be as powerful a moment as it is. So Jesus has set this table, and what's required for you to come forward is know you're forgiven and a desire to walk closer to him. And that's all that's required. So as you come today, remember the perspective of Mark. Jesus was fully God. He was fully man. And he was king on his terms. So how is Jesus king for you? Pray with me. God, thank you that Jesus refused to be king on anybody's terms but his own. And that in that kingship, we're forgiven. So as we come forward today and take the bread and the cup and remember what Jesus did for us, what he is doing for us now, and that one day we'll see him face to face. Let this table remind us Jesus is only king on his terms. And if we do anything less than that, we're making him king on our terms. And this is just bread and juice. But this is a supernatural moment because